I'm James Ezimoha and you're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. US President Donald Trump has rejected Iran's counter-proposal on ending the conflict between the two countries. Evacuation flights leave Spain after Hantavirus outbreak on luxury cruise ship as more passengers test positive. And EU Foreign Policy Chief Kai Kallas rejects Vladimir Putin's suggestions over talks with Moscow. US President Donald Trump has rejected Iran's response to a proposal aimed at ending the ongoing conflict between the two countries. The rejection follows a counter-proposal from Tehran that included demands for sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz and financial compensation. Meanwhile, Israel still maintains that any agreement must ensure the removal of Iran's enriched uranium.
The latest attempt to end the conflict between Washington and Tehran has reached a deadlock. On Sunday, US President Donald Trump rejected a response from Iran delivered through Pakistani mediators, signaling that the current terms are insufficient for a US agreement. Writing on social media, the president stated he had reviewed the response from Iranian representatives and found it totally unacceptable. The Iranian proposal, as reported by state media, sought several key concessions in exchange for peace. Tehran is demanding full sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, the lifting of all US sanctions, and financial compensation for damages incurred during the recent escalation. Iranian sources, cited by the Tasnim news agency, claim their position is based on the rights of the Iranian people and suggest that the US proposal required what they termed submission to excessive demands. Adding to the complexity is the position of Israel. In an interview with CBS News, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu emphasized that any lasting deal must address Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Netanyahu stated that the war is not over as long as Iran possesses enriched uranium.
It accomplished a great deal, but it's not over because there's still nuclear material, enriched uranium that has to be taken out of Iran. There's still enrichment sites that have to be dismantled. There are still proxies that Iran supports. There are ballistic missiles that they still want to produce. Now, we've degraded a lot of it, but all of that is still there, and there's work to be done.
The current situation follows military engagements in February, which led to a Pakistani-mediated ceasefire in April. While President Trump has extended this truce without a fixed deadline, a formal peace treaty has not been signed. Mediators in Pakistan continue to facilitate communication between the two sides, though no timeline for further talks has been established.
Meanwhile, Iran intensified diplomatic outreach while senior officials insisted Tehran would only participate in negotiations that project its national interest. Our correspondent brings us more.
Efforts to halt the Iran-US war appear stalled, despite Tehran submitting its official response to Washington's proposals, which the Iranian state-owned broadcaster IRIB termed excessive demands of the US. The official IRNA news agency reported on Sunday that according to Iran's proposed plan, upcoming negotiations will focus at this stage on ending the war in the region. Also, semi-official sources, including the Tasnim news agency, affiliated to the Revolutionary Guards, reported that Iran's draft proposal for talks with the US demands ending the war, removing sanctions, and lifting naval blockade, excluding the nuclear dispute from the agenda. On Sunday, US President Donald Trump rejected Iran's response, delivered through Pakistani mediators, indicating that Tehran's proposed terms were not sufficient for an agreement. Meantime, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, in a meeting, stated that Iran will not surrender in the negotiations and will take part in the talks only to secure its national interests, his office reported. And at the diplomatic front, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi held phone calls over the weekend with his counterparts from Qatar, Egypt, the Netherlands, the UK, and Turkey. The foreign ministry said their talks focused on the latest regional developments and the current diplomatic process between Iran and the US, mediated by Pakistan. And his deputy for legal affairs, Kazem Gharibabadi, in a post on X, warned against the UK and France's decision on deployment of warships to the Strait of Hormuz. The high-ranking Iranian diplomat said they are strongly advised not to further complicate the situation. Turaj Shiralilu from downtown Tehran for A News.
Now, as fighting continues along the front line in Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin says the conflict in Ukraine could be nearing an end. Meantime, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signals Kyiv's openness to direct talks.
War in Ukraine remains active despite renewed diplomatic signals and a temporary ceasefire between Moscow and Kyiv. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the conflict in Ukraine could be coming to an end, while signaling openness to talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky aimed at reaching a long-term peace agreement. Speaking to reporters in Moscow after Russia's Victory Day celebrations, Putin accused Western countries of fueling the war through NATO expansion and continued military support for Kyiv. He said Russia would be prepared to meet with Zelensky either in Moscow or in a third country, but only if discussions are focused on finalizing a lasting peace deal. Putin also said Russia had proposed a prisoner exchange involving 500 captives even before US President Donald Trump suggested broader ceasefire efforts, adding that Moscow had not yet received a response from Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine later agreed to a larger 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner swap as part of a 3-day ceasefire running through Monday. Despite the ceasefire, both sides accused each other of continued attacks. Russia's defense ministry claimed Ukrainian forces carried out thousands of ceasefire violations, including drone strikes and shelling. Ukraine, meanwhile, said Russian troops continued assaults along key frontline areas. Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia had refrained from large-scale missile and air attacks, but was still carrying out combat operations near the front line.
In other words, the Russian army is not observing the silence at the front and is not even particularly trying to. All our Ukrainian units are acting in a mirror-like manner, defending our positions exactly as required.
Zelensky also confirmed preparations for the planned prisoner exchange and said the United States was involved in guaranteeing implementation of the agreement.
European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas has dismissed Russian President Vladimir Putin's suggestion that former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder could represent Europe in any future talks with Moscow. She made the comments ahead of a meeting of EU foreign ministers in Brussels.
First, if we give the right to Russia to appoint a negotiator on our behalf, that would not be very wise. And second, I think Gerhard Schröder has been the high-level lobbyist for Russian state-owned companies. So it's clear why Putin wants him to be the person, so that actually, he would be sitting on both sides of the table.
Now, EU foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels on Monday to discuss the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, along with developments in the Western Balkans. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said she hopes ministers will agree on sanctions against violent Israeli settlers after previous efforts were blocked by Hungary's former Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Separately, the EU and Canada are set to host a meeting on the return of Ukrainian children allegedly taken to Russia during the war. The event brings together around 50 countries and organizations to discuss tracing, returning and reintegrating the children and possible sanctions against those responsible. Now, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is fighting for his political future. There have been growing calls for his resignation following the Labour Party's poor results in local elections. Starmer delivered a major speech on Monday in an attempt to restore calm. Ollie Barrett has more from London.
Well, this was billed as the speech of Keir Starmer's political life, and a speech that may or may not save his job. And that very much remains to be seen over the coming hours, days, potentially weeks and months, if he remains in post that long. And one of the things that Keir Starmer admitted was that his government hasn't gone far enough and fast enough in some of the change that he admits that the UK needs. He didn't set out huge amounts of new policy in this speech. He did say that British steel is going to be nationalised under new legislation. That went down very well in the room, and many Labour MPs will be pleased about that news. He talked about putting the UK at the centre of Europe and talked up the idea of a youth migration scheme of some sort with the European Union. But as I say, not a huge amount of new policy in there. He did admit that he has made mistakes. He did acknowledge that many people have frustrations with him as leader, and he talked about that in the context of voters up and down the country, but also people within his own Labour Party as well. As I say, it remains to be seen whether this is the speech that saved his job. There could still be leadership challenges coming his way in the coming hours, if not days. And Keir Starmer said that if there were leadership challenges against him, that he would fight on, that he intends to stay in his post. But the elections that we had last week, with the results coming in over the course of Friday and through the weekend as well, have been very, very disheartening for many Labour supporters and many within the Labour movement itself. And that's why there is such speculation about the possibility of a leadership challenge, and some of those Labour MPs calling publicly for Keir Starmer to resign. He says he's not going anywhere. It may still not be entirely up to him, though. Ollie Barrett in London for A News.
Now, 2 more passengers from the MV Honduras cruise ship have tested positive for Hantavirus. That raises the total number of confirmed cases to 10 as countries continue efforts to repatriate and isolate those who were on board.
An American and a French national have tested positive for hantavirus infections as countries around the world repatriate passengers from a cruise ship hit by a deadly outbreak. French Health Minister Stéphanie Rist said on Monday that a French passenger who was on the MV Hondius cruise ship tested positive for the virus, and her condition was deteriorating. The patient is a woman who was among 5 French nationals evacuated from the vessel and flown from Spain's Canary Islands to France on Sunday. However, officials urged the public to remain calm.
There is no reason to cause panic among the French people at this time. The strictest measures are being taken. Again, this is perfectly normal. It's what we expect from the government. We are monitoring the situation with the utmost vigilance, based on a virus that we know.
The 4 other French nationals tested negative for the virus, but will remain in isolation for at least 15 days. Meanwhile, the US Department of Health and Human Services said on Sunday that an American on a repatriation flight had tested mildly positive for the virus, and another had mild symptoms. Both were travelling in the plane's biocontainment units out of an abundance of caution, and all 17 MV Hondius passengers on board would undergo clinical assessment upon arrival in the US. The 2 latest infections bring the total number of confirmed cases to 10 as an international evacuation operation continues. The MV Hondius arrived in the Canary Islands carrying more than 140 passengers and crew from 23 countries after spending several days stranded off Cape Verde.
Now, global attention is turning to high-level talks between the United States and China as both sides attempt to stabilize relations following months of economic and geopolitical tensions. Leaders are expected to focus on trade, cooperation, and key international security concerns.
US President Donald Trump is set to visit China this week for high-level talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, marking the first in-person summit between the two leaders in over 6 months. Discussions are expected to focus on trade, artificial intelligence, Taiwan, Iran, rare earth supply chains, and the overall geopolitical tensions as both sides seek to stabilize increasingly strained bilateral ties. The visit comes during a fragile trade truce following months of tariff disputes and export restrictions between Washington and Beijing. US officials say that the two countries are exploring mechanisms for deeper economic coordination, including a possible Board of Trade and Investment Forum, while China is expected to announce additional purchases of American goods, including aircraft and agricultural products. Regional security concerns are also expected to dominate the summit agenda, especially tensions surrounding Taiwan and the Middle East. Washington is reportedly seeking greater Chinese pressure on Iran following recent regional instability, while Beijing is expected to push back against US support for Taiwan and growing American restrictions on Chinese technology development. Analysts say that the meeting is aimed more at preventing further deterioration in relations rather than achieving a major breakthrough. Manu Makhtoom, A News, Beijing.
Now, Hezbollah has launched attacks against Israeli forces as deadly strikes across Lebanon kill at least 21 people, pushing the fragile ceasefire to the brink of collapse. The group claims its drones and missiles targeted Israeli command centers in response to truce violations. Meanwhile, Lebanese health officials report that children are among the victims of the latest Israeli bombardment. The Israeli military says it intercepted several hostile targets, accusing Hezbollah of breaching the agreement. Now, France is stepping up its push for stronger ties with Africa. President Emmanuel Macron is in Kenya, where he is meeting with African leaders at the Africa Forward Summit. It comes amid growing competition for influence on the continent.
Welcome, Your Excellencies.
More than 30 African leaders gathered in Nairobi on Monday for the Africa Forward Summit, inaugurated by French President Emmanuel Macron. The meeting comes as France looks to rebuild partnerships in Africa. It follows setbacks in several former colonies in West Africa and the Sahel region, where leaders have reduced security and business ties with Paris. Speaking alongside Kenyan President William Ruto during a discussion on technology and artificial intelligence, Macron said Africa and Europe should work together to reduce reliance on the United States and China.
A lot of solutions are made in the US or made in China. And when you speak about artificial intelligence, okay, a lot of us today are consumers. So I think we have a common fight, a common battle together of investment, which is to build our strategic autonomy for Europe and Africa. And if we build it together, we will be much stronger.
Kenya says it hopes the summit will help attract more French investment and support efforts to reform global financing systems for heavily indebted African nations.
India is facing growing pressure from rising global energy costs and ongoing supply disruptions. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is now urging people to change daily habits to help reduce fuel use and save foreign currency.
India is urging citizens to reduce fuel consumption and adopt more cost-saving habits as rising global energy prices continue to put pressure on the country's economy and foreign currency reserves. Speaking at a public rally in Secunderabad, Prime Minister Narendra Modi called for a return to some pandemic-era practices, including work-from-home arrangements and greater use of public transport.
In this time of global crisis, we have to make a resolution keeping duty paramount and fulfill it with complete dedication. A big resolution is to use petrol and diesel sparingly. We must curb our use of petrol and diesel.
Modi also urged people to limit unnecessary foreign travel, avoid non-essential purchases such as gold, and consider carpooling to help reduce fuel demand. He said India's heavy reliance on imported oil, which accounts for around 90% of the country's crude needs, has left it vulnerable to global supply disruptions and rising energy prices. Modi also encouraged farmers to reduce chemical fertiliser use and move toward natural farming to cut import costs. Analysts say the remarks highlight growing concern over the impact of higher energy prices on the wider economy and the weakening rupee. Although fuel prices have so far remained unchanged, economists say revisions could follow if global supply pressures continue. The government has not announced any immediate policy measures, but indicated that further steps to manage energy demand may be considered.
All right, after the break, we'll examine the significance of high-level talks between the European Union and Syrian officials in Brussels as diplomatic engagement with Syria appears to be entering a new phase. Stay with
and welcome to Prime Time. What a show we've got lined up for you today. In a complex world, clarity is power. Two hours live, diplomacy dissected in a spin-free environment. That's Prime Time with me, Guy Schoen, weekdays on A News.
Welcome back to A News. Now, senior officials from the European Union and Syria have met in Brussels amid renewed international debate over Syria's diplomatic future. The meeting comes as the region continues cautious re-engagement with Syria, raising questions over whether Europe is adjusting its own approach. Joining us to discuss this is Hadel Uwais, editor-in-chief for Jusor News and political analyst, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, after years of political isolation, what does this Brussels meeting say about how the EU now views engagement with Syria?
Yes, thank you again. And of course, it tells us how important is this relation and connection between Syria and Europe. For both parties, there is mutual interest today for Syrians and Europeans for this collaboration. Of course, one of the priorities for Europeans is to bring back a number of Syrian refugees to their countries, especially refugees who did not get the citizenship for European countries yet. But it's not the only issue. In addition to that, Europe wants to be more engaged with Syria, wants to make sure that terrorist organizations won't emerge and be active again in Syria, not just because these terrorist organizations were able to export terrorists to the West and to Europe, but also the ideas of these terrorist organizations like ISIS once inspired many lone wolf attacks in Europe. So both parties believe that with close collaboration, they can maintain stability in both Europe and Syria.
Now, Arab states have already reopened channels with Damascus. Has regional normalization effectively forced Europe to reconsider its own position?
Of course, the Arab positions and the American positions, President Trump initiatives in lifting sanctions from Syria also directed the attention of Europe to the importance of the relation in Syria. But the entire world needs Syria. They wanted this relation with Syria. It was very bad for the international community that Syria was isolated, linked to this relation with Iran, being isolated like Iran. That resulted into a lot of troubles. What happened in Syria during the civil war and the uprising did not stay in Syria. It resulted into millions of refugees, economic, social crises in Europe and the neighboring countries. This is why the new change, the big change that happened in Syria with the collapse of the Assad regime gave the world hope that Syria can be an effective and productive player in the international community. This is why we see all these countries eager to work with Syria and eager to make Syria succeed. And this is why we heard today in Brussels that European countries are going to give very generous grants for Syria for rebuilding.
Now, would you say that the strategy of isolating Syria has reached its limit, particularly if the goal was to influence political behavior on the ground?
Of course, today Syria is living a new era, and everybody has hope that the new government in Syria will be more collaborative with the international community. Even before the collapse of the Assad regime, the Arab countries tried to give Assad, the former president of Syria, a chance. They asked him to be more moderate and not that close to Iran. They asked him not to give Iran militias a safe haven in Syria to attack Israel, Arab countries and regional powers. But we saw that Assad failed in doing so. He could not push Iran and its militias out of Syria, and this is why even Russians gave up on the Assad regime and tried to give Syria a chance with a different government, with big change. And that's why we see all the world hopeful about the new change in Syria, and they believe that isolating Syria was not a great idea, but there were not a lot of options other than isolating Syria under the Assad regime, who killed almost 500,000 citizens from his own countries. In addition to that, we see Europe very interested in working closely with the Syrians, because as we know, there is a big rift today between Europeans and the Trump administration and the United States in general, and they know that they can't count on the US to maintain stability or in Syria or elsewhere in the Middle East. They know that with the current isolationist policy for Washington is not going to solve the European issues in Syria or elsewhere in the Middle East. So they have to do it by themselves, and this is why we see a European policy independent from Washington taking place in Syria.
Now, reconstruction obviously remains impossible without broader economic relief. So is the EU prepared to rethink sanctions policy in practical terms?
Of course, EU started to lift sanctions from Syria, but it's not just all about lifting sanctions. Lifting sanctions will give the businesses, private businesses, the chance to work with Syria. But as you know, private businesses are looking for a safe environment, stable countries. And when a lot of people hear Syria, they think of civil war, they think of instability, and private businesses won't easily go and invest in Syria. This is why the governments are also granting Syria, European governments are granting Syria money for rebuilding. But let's remember that rebuilding Syria will take a couple of billions of dollars, big amounts of money that until today we didn't hear any country, Arab country or European country, talking about giving them to Syria. They are trying to help, but there is still a lot of need, very big need for more money. And under the current situation with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, with the economic crisis, also in the oil-rich Arab countries, in Europe, things don't seem very optimistic when it comes to giving Syria big grants.
Mm-hmm. Now, how much of this renewed engagement with Syria is driven by European concerns over migration or refugee returns, or even long-term regional stability?
I think big part of it is about refugees, because we know there is a refugees crisis in Europe. A couple of European countries are now electing right-wing politicians who are not very excited about the idea of bringing more refugees or keeping the refugees that they already welcomed years ago. So the idea of sending back refugees to Syria is very exciting for many right-wing politicians in Europe, and it's going to bring them a lot of votes. So this is big part of it. But also, it's not just about refugees. It's about the big instability that took place in the Middle East, in the neighboring countries, when Syria was unstable. Syria is in a very strategic location in important countries, and instability, emergence of ISIS, civil war in Syria also resulted into a lot of issues for Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and that also required the European countries to give big grants for humanitarian aid and assistance for neighboring countries. So it's very complicated. It's also about inspiring terrorists in the West, and this is why everyone is eager that this new Syrian model should succeed.
Now, is there a danger that engagement without political concession could be seen as legitimizing the Syrian leadership without securing reforms?
I think there is accountability. I think the European countries are making sure that they tell the new Syrian government that they are watching. They are watching how they are treating the minorities, journalism, free press, how they are governing Syria. And this is why we don't see so far like really unprecedented big grants, big chunks of money being sent to Syria. I think that will be conditional, and we keep hearing when there are troubling news in Syria regarding minorities or something else. We hear concerns, we hear condemnation from European leaders, but at the end of the day, I think the West at a point where they believe that they can't make fundamental and big changes and push countries in the Middle East to democracy despite of their desire, and they think of Iraq model and how the United States failed into implementing the democracy that's similar to the Western model that the US was hoping for. Although there is democracy today in Iraq, Iraq is one of very few countries in the Middle East where there are real elections. But still, I don't think the Europeans or even the Americans at a point where they think that they want to implement the Western model on Muslim communities in the Middle East.
I'm just going to go back and touch upon what you just mentioned. Speaking about the West, how closely aligned are Europe and the United States on Syria today? And are subtle differences beginning to emerge?
I think they are on the same page in general. The Europeans and the Americans want Syria to succeed. They want Syria to flourish. They want Europe to be able to send refugees back, and they don't want Syria to cause any instability for the neighboring countries, including Israel. But when it comes to the consequences of any instability in Syria, the ramifications of any troubles in Syria are heavier on Europeans than the Americans. And this is the core reason for the rift today between the Europeans and the Americans. Even what happens in Europe, President Trump said, we have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is not impacting us in the United States. And this is how they think about Syria also when it comes to American. They think that what happens in Syria is not very impactful on the United States, while it's very impactful on Europe. And this is the difference. And this is why we see Europe more active. Although we hear a lot of rhetoric and statements from President Trump and American politicians about Syria. President Trump welcomed Ahmed al-Shara, the Syrian president, in the White House. He lifted sanctions. But when it comes to reality, when you look at the ground, you see that the United States, the US envoy to Syria, are giving the Syrian issue and leaving it to Israelis, to Turks, to neighboring countries and US allies in the region, without dealing closely with the small issues on the ground in Syria. I think Europe wants to be closer and wants to solve the reasons and the roots of their concerns in Syria by themselves without waiting the United States to deal with it at this point, because they know that President Trump is not going to give a lot of diplomatic and even financial efforts to stabilize things in Syria.
I just want to take you back to what you just mentioned. Do you think it's, from the perspective of the United States, do you think it's a strategic move to isolate themselves, or not isolate, but then not be involved as much as the EU with regards to Syria, or you think it's a risk in general?
So this isolationist policy emerged with maybe with the President Obama, not only with President Trump, for different reasons. President Obama said, we don't want the United States to be the policeman of the world, so we don't want to go into more adventures, diplomatic or military adventures in the Middle East or elsewhere, because they looked at Iraq model and they see that it did not benefit the United States a lot, and they don't want to give a lot of efforts to deal with issues in the Middle East. So this is what the American voters want. And then the American voters voted for President Trump, who his main slogan was America first, make America great again, focus on America only. So this is what the American voters want. They don't want the United States to be exhausted in issues in the Middle East or elsewhere, or even in Europe. We see how President Trump is resisting giving more aid to Europe because, according to him, it's a European issue and not an American issue. And I think United States will go in this direction more and more for different reasons, whether under the slogan America first or under the leftist slogan we don't want America to be the policeman of the world. But of course, President Trump recently broke all these rules when he intervened in Iran and waged these military attacks on Iran. But also, I think the results of this military campaign in Iran that's not reaching its goals until now will push America to be more isolationist, because they have now another example of failed attempts to intervene, to make change by force.
Thank you very much for sharing your time and insights with us today.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, we'll take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. Stay with us.
Inside Politics delves deeply into the heart of global issues shaping our world today. Join me for your go-to source of political analysis from across the region and beyond.
Welcome back to Way News, and now we turn our attention to regional stories. Afghanistan and Azerbaijan are deepening economic ties through a new agreement. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has the details.
Afghanistan has signed a new gold mining contract with Afghan and Azerbaijani companies worth more than $20 million. The Ministry of Mines and Petroleum says the 5-year deal covers a gold mine in Kalazal district of northern Kunduz province. The agreement was signed here in Kabul by the Minister of Mines and Petroleum, Hidayatullah Badri, with Subhan Moment Company and Azerbaijan's Reef Group LLC. Officials say the mine covers an area of about 6 square kilometers. with a total planned investment of over $20 million. Under the deal, the companies are expected to pay a 30% royalty to Afghan authorities. The Ministry of Mines says the companies will invest $200,000 in social services and create around 100 direct and indirect jobs. The signing ceremony was attended by the ambassador of Azerbaijan in Kabul. He welcomed the agreement and said Azerbaijani companies were interested in further investment in Afghanistan's mining sector. Minister Badri described the contract as a positive step toward strengthening economic relations between Afghanistan and Azerbaijan. The deal comes as Afghanistan seeks more foreign investment in mining and infrastructure, while Azerbaijan shows growing interest in the country's mineral, trade and transit sectors. The Kunduz gold contract is therefore being seen not only as a mining agreement but also as part of efforts to deepen Afghanistan's economic ties with regional partners, including Azerbaijan. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has held a meeting with Belgium's Queen Mathilde in Istanbul. It's part of an ongoing Belgium economic mission to Turkey focused on expanding trade and investment. Our correspondent Adam Morrow has more from Turkey.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Monday met Belgium's Queen Mathilde in Istanbul in a visit focused largely on trade, investment, and broader cooperation between the two countries. The closed-door meeting took place as part of a landmark Belgian economic mission to Turkey, which also aims to strengthen ties between Brussels and Ankara. The Queen arrived in Turkey on Sunday at the head of a high-level delegation that includes Belgian Foreign Minister Maxime Prévost and Defense Minister Theo Franken, who also holds the foreign trade portfolio. More than 400 Belgian business leaders, academics, and policymakers are also taking part in the mission. Earlier Monday, Turkey and Belgium inked an agreement to step up bilateral trade relations, which was signed by Prévost, Franken, and Turkish Trade Minister Omar Bolat. Speaking at the signing ceremony, Prévost emphasized that the Queen's participation served to underline the importance Brussels attaches to its relationship with Turkey. Bolat, for his part, called for Belgian support in expanding the Turkey-EU customs union, which in its current form only covers industrial goods and processed agricultural products. A Turkey-Belgium economic forum is slated for Wednesday, where further agreements are expected, including some in the fields of defense and aviation. The mission also serves to highlight the importance of Belgium's sizable Turkish community, estimated at around 400,000 people, which has traditionally served as a bridge between the two countries. Belgium is also significant for Ankara because Brussels is home to the headquarters of both the European Union and the NATO alliance. For Turkey, which is both a NATO member and an EU candidate country, the visit is about more than just trade. It's also about deeper strategic engagement with Europe. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Georgia has a new spiritual leader. After nearly 5 decades under the same patriarch, the Georgian Orthodox Church has chosen its 142nd Catholicos patriarch. His name is Shihel, and his election today closes one of the historic eras and opens another. Our correspondent brings us more.
Metropolitan Shio Mujiri has been elected the 142nd Catholicos Patriarch of all Georgia. At today's expanded council at the Holy Trinity Cathedral, he received 22 votes. His rivals Ioba Kiashvili and Grigol Berbichashvili received 9 and 7 respectively, while one ballot was spoiled. The margin was narrow. Nearly half the Synod voted against him. 17 bishops backed other candidates or cast invalid ballots. That represents a significant opposition bloc, and it is unlikely to disappear quietly. This result did not come out of nowhere. On 28 April, the Holy Synod held a preliminary secret ballot to select the 3 final candidates. She received 20 votes, the bare minimum required to secure victory, while the other 2 candidates received 7 votes each. He entered today's final vote as the clear frontrunner, but gained only 2 additional votes in the expanded council. To understand why Shio emerged as the leading candidate, it is necessary to look farther back. Ilya II himself named Mujeri as his designated successor in 2017, effectively endorsing him as the future patriarch. For 9 years, Shio served as Ilya's right hand, helping to run the church as the patriarch's health declined. It was Shio who announced Ilya's death outside the Caucasus Medical Center on 17th March. Ilya II had led the church for nearly 49 years, the longest-serving patriarch in its history. He oversaw a spiritual revival after the Soviet era, restored churches and monasteries across the country, and became godfather to tens of thousands of Georgian children, creating a bond with the nation that will be difficult to replicate. His Holiness Shio III accepted his new role with these words: "I accept my distinction as Catholicos Patriarch with obedience, God's grace and hope." Nini Nikolaishvili, Tbilisi, A-News.
Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev has dismissed long-standing mediation efforts, criticized recent Western involvement, and set out Baku's priorities: regional negotiations, reconstruction of liberated territories, and readiness to respond to any new provocations.
Speaking from the rebuilt city of Zangilan, President Ilham Aliyev addressed the international pressure Azerbaijan faced during and after the conflict, specifically highlighting the role of the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs.
First of all, there were the co-chairs of the OSCE Minsk Group. Each of those countries wanted to stop us for its own reasons. Those countries are not ordinary states, they are nuclear powers and permanent members of the UN Security Council. Each of them was doing its utmost to make this occupation permanent, to use it as a tool, and ultimately to deny the Azerbaijani people the opportunity to breathe freely.
Though not naming him directly, the president's focus turned to French President Emmanuel Macron. Diplomatic sources suggest Macron recently attempted to orchestrate a symbolic entry into Armenia via the Turkish land border. While some voices within the Turkish diplomatic establishment reportedly supported the idea, the move was blocked by the firm coordination between President Aliyev and President Erdogan.
Bugün Ermenistan'a gelip özünü sahte qəhrəman kimi
Certain foreign leaders who now visit Armenia and portray themselves as false heroes were the very same leaders in power in 2020. They should have come then and stood up for Armenia. There is nothing but empty talk. That is all they do, which is why their support ratings in their own countries remain at 10 to 15%. Now they allegedly claim to have rescued Armenia from our hands.
İndi güya ki Ermənistanı bizim əlimizdən onlar çıxarıb xilas edib.
The president also dismissed the effectiveness of the European monitoring mission currently on the border, characterizing their presence as a performative gesture rather than a security necessity.
Presenting themselves as false heroes in Armenia, as though they stopped Azerbaijan, as if this aggressive Azerbaijan would otherwise have destroyed Armenia, is complete nonsense. Today, Europe's so-called observers are still supposedly monitoring the border. I said it then as well. If we fired a single shot, they would flee immediately, and not even a trace of them would remain there.
President Aliyev concluded by emphasizing that Azerbaijan's military strength remains the primary factor in regional stability.
Bugün biz sülh şəraitində yaşayırıq və sülhün müəllifi də bizik.
Today we live in conditions of peace, and we are the authors of this peace. Had we not wanted it, there would be no peace. If we had wished, we could have conducted military operations anywhere. The Armenian leadership knows this, and those standing behind them know it as well. No matter how much support they provide Armenia, they know they stand no chance against our strength.
Bizim gücümüzə qarşı onların heç bir şansı yoxdur.
OSCE Minsk Group mediation has been sidelined. Baku says future steps will center on regional talks and reconstruction.
China and Tajikistan are moving to deepen their strategic partnership as President Emomali Rahmon arrives in Beijing for high-level talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The visit comes amid growing economic cooperation and expanding Chinese involvement across Central Asia. Our correspondent has more from Almaty.
Tajik President Emomali Rahmon is in Beijing for a state visit hosted by Chinese leader Xi Jinping as China continues to expand its economic and political presence in Central Asia. The visit comes at a time of rapidly growing cooperation between the two countries. Officials say the talks will focus on trade, investment, energy, green development and digital technologies, with both sides also expected to sign a new package of bilateral agreements aimed at deepening long-term cooperation. This is already Rahmon's 15th visit to China, reflecting how important Beijing has become for Tajikistan's economy. China is now one of the country's biggest investors and trading partners, and economic ties are growing fast. In just the first 3 months of this year, trade turnover between the two countries reached nearly $800 million, more than double compared to the same period last year. The visit also follows a recent agreement on the construction of 9 border outposts along the Tajik-Afghan border. The $60 million project will be fully financed by China, adding to Beijing's growing involvement in infrastructure and regional security projects across Central Asia. And against that backdrop, Rahmon's visit to Beijing is being seen as another sign of increasingly close coordination between the two countries on both economic and strategic issues. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Italy's former ambassador to Uzbekistan has been arrested in connection with an alleged illegal visa scheme involving Russian citizens. Our correspondent Severa Japova has more.
Italian authorities have arrested former ambassador to Uzbekistan, Pier Gabriele Papadia de Bottini di Santianes, and his associate Tatiana Tarakanova, over allegations of illegally issuing Schengen visas through the Italian embassy in Tashkent. According to La Repubblica, investigators believe the pair organized a system allowing Russian citizens who did not meet legal requirements to obtain long-term tourist visas in exchange for payments ranging from 4,000 to 16,000 euros. Prosecutors say the operation allegedly involved Moscow-based travel agencies and applications submitted through Telegram. At least 95 Russian citizens reportedly entered Italy through the scheme, despite lacking required documentation or residency status. The investigation began after an inspection by Italy's Foreign Ministry in July 2025 uncovered irregularities in embassy visa procedures, including applicants allegedly missing from official embassy entry records. Papadia served as Italy's ambassador to Uzbekistan from December 2024 until his dismissal in December 2025. His diplomatic mission focused on political, economic and consular cooperation between Italy and Uzbekistan. Recent reporting by Anadolu Agency and the New Voice of Ukraine says authorities are now reviewing around 400 visa applications and examining the former ambassador's financial assets. Italian authorities continue to investigate allegations of corruption, abuse of office and facilitating illegal immigration. So far, no accusations have been publicly directed at Uzbek institutions or authorities. It is Severa Japova reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
All right, that's all we have for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to A News.